Oh, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and I am outdoors, so you may have some background noise, but it's a beautiful day. And we are beginning episode 11 in the Miami series. In episode 10, which was a very important episode because it is the beginning of the transition, the documented transition. By that, I mean the anti-Castro cause transitioning to an anti-Kennedy cause. And you can't say that the conspirators did not lay out for Kennedy exactly what it would look like. All you have to do is substitute Kennedy's name for Castro's and how an Operation Northwoods would be carried out. And so, most likely, it was planned that this Operation Northwoods would take place in Miami. That's what was in the documents. Most of these operations would take place in Miami, which is the epicenter of all the anti-Castro activities. It just so happens that the Operation Northwoods was foiled in Miami twice the same day. That will be the subject of two more episodes to come. And so it was moved to Dallas, and that is where the assassination took place. But it was originally planned, I believe, for Miami. Today, and of course, this whole Operation Northwoods uh, unveiling took place in March of 62. And so we are continuing with 62 because right on the heels in that same year comes the most seminal moment in the Kennedy presidency, at least outwardly, at least from an outside perspective, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as we have discussed earlier, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a direct result of the Bay of Pigs in 61. First, because it was evidence of a U.S. intent to invade Cuba. And second, because subsequent to the invasion, when Kennedy made his promise to Khrushchev not to meddle in the affairs of Cuba anymore, he lied. And Khrushchev knew that he lied. And so to repel a future invasion from in his view, untrustworthy president, uh, Khrushchev, and this is according to his own son, put missiles in Cuba to make the American president at least think twice about invading Cuba again. So uh, this, like anything, this is one of the things about history. It builds. Nothing happens in a vacuum. He didn't just wake up one morning and decide to put missiles in Cuba for no reason. He put missiles in Cuba because of what had happened uh, in April of 61 and in subsequent months. And so whatever happens after this is going to impact what happens next. It's just how history works. It builds event upon event, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, in October of 62, now this is when we found out. Obviously, he had ordered this much sooner, and this is why by the time we found out, missile bases were almost completed. Anyway, in October of 62, Premier Khrushchev ordered missiles into Cuba to repel a future U.S. invasion. And these are nuclear tipped missiles, which are within, as you can see here, uh, what a counteract or what a response if we send another paramilitary force, or even if we send U.S. military down into Cuba to invade before they even land. Of course, the Soviets are going to know. Uh, and we've talked earlier about how Castro would know even before they left Miami because of the spies. And look at the range these nuclear missiles would have, all the different cities to choose from for their response, a nuclear response to an invasion, something Kennedy didn't want to do. This is intolerable. If you're an American president, you cannot allow this to stand. You cannot subject 67, 70% of your country and all the cities in your country to a nuclear attack, first strike attack uh, by the Russians. Not in 1962, probably not now either. So this is this is going to be an untenable situation, clearly. But it's brought about because of what happened a year earlier during and after Bay of Pigs. So, as we know, and we've made a big point of this, Cuba is only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. And it was so it's one thing to have the Soviets in our hemisphere. It's another thing entirely to be closer to our shores than even one of our states. Uh, Cuba is closer to America and all of these targets than our 50th state or 49th state, Alaska. So, you're talking about a very strategic location. If you're the Soviets, this is why you made the deal with Castro, because it gives you a first strike capability that you didn't have before. The Americans always had the advantage because we had allies in Europe that bordered the Soviet Union where we could put first strike missiles and aim them at the Soviet Union. The Soviets did not have an ally in our hemisphere close enough for them to return the favor. Now they do. And so this is it's been the bug in the bonnet for us ever since. And an argument could be made. We drove Cuba into the arms of the Soviets to begin with our response to the Cuban Revolution. So again, here you see history building upon itself. We've clearly mishandled or mismanaged the Cuba situation from the outset. And I lay a lot of that blame at Eisenhower's feet because I think he was persuaded by Nixon. I think most of this, what is happening in Cuba with Kennedy now as president, is a direct result of Nixon putting in motion a series of events that has left Kennedy with very few options. I think Nixon started all this, but he was the vice president. He had to get permission from his boss, and Eisenhower gave him that permission. So ultimately, it falls on Eisenhower. I don't know why Eisenhower seems to escape the a close examination of certain things. For example, he's the one that gave that famous speech about the military-industrial complex, what a threat it had become. And yet, during his 8 years as president, he did nothing to curtail it. In fact, it expanded on his watch. He was largely responsible for the military-industrial complex becoming what it had become. And then, on his way out the door, he warned the future president, hey, you're going to have to deal with this. I didn't deal with it, but you're going to have to. And then this Cuba situation, which he lays like a big giant turd on Kennedy's doorsteps. So you're going to have to handle this. He also hands him a Vietnam a situation that's percolating in Vietnam. I mean, in any number of ways, Eisenhower hands the incoming administration, which remember now, we're going from the oldest, most experienced president to the youngest, least experienced president. And he's handing him one foreign policy hot potato after another. He said, you deal with it, it's your turn. So we have a situation with the Soviets, based on the imagery that we're getting back from our U-2 spy planes, are putting offensive missiles only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. And the reason we know they're offensive missiles, there is a distinction between defensive and offensive in terms of their length. Offensive missiles are much longer. They usually have to fly much further. Defensive missiles only have to intercept up in the skies above from where they're shot, so that they're much shorter. So I couldn't tell you how long that an offensive missile is, but the experts could look at these photos and immediately tell these are offensive missiles. And so this is all about a first strike. And here again is another example of how the United States has become almost overnight. We've gotten used to this psychology we as Americans have, and it's subconscious, maybe it's conscious in some cases, but the way wars used to be fought land, sea. When you are surrounded by, on one coast, the Atlantic Ocean, on another coast, the Pacific, and then above you, you have a non-threatening ally, Canada, and below you, you have a non-threatening ally, Mexico, you feel pretty secure. And indeed, it hadn't been that long since we fought World War I, World War II, and all the fighting took place in Europe. When the wars were over, we came back with the least amount of casualties and very little, if any, physical damage to our infrastructure here at home. None of the fighting took place here. In fact, the last time fighting took place on our shores was a civil war. And of course, that was a devastating war to our infrastructure and cities and populations, etc., but farmland. But World War I, World War II, all of that happened in Europe, faraway places. And so we came out of World War I, World War II smelling like a rose. We were the country that still had factories that could produce things. Everybody had to buy manufactured goods from us. We were the country that had farmland, hadn't been touched. We could feed the world. For all these reasons, we came out of that because we had this security blanket called these oceans and these countries to the north and the south of us that were on our side. It's one of the reasons why allegedly Germany approached Mexico about supporting them in the cause against the Americans. Americans hadn't joined the war yet, but they knew it was coming. And if they did help us, or they did help the Germans after the war, assuming that they won, they promised Mexico they'd get all their lost territory back, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, this was famously referred to as the Zimmerman Note. It got us involved in World War I because even the Germans understood we don't have a base from which to attack America, at least a base that's on shore. We need a base. It's not that we need the Mexican army's support. We need their land from which we can launch attacks against the Americans. And we considered that to be an act of war. And but now the Soviets, our big enemy in the post-World War II era, Cold War era, they do have a base. It's 90 miles off our coast. And the nature of war has changed. It's no longer land and sea. Now you can shoot these missiles through the skies and just inundate your target with missile after missile after missile. They might shoot down a few, but some of them are going to get through, and they're nuclear tipped. And my God. So you see why all of a sudden this it would be serious even if it wasn't. These weren't nuclear tipped missiles because of the proximity, how close they were to Miami. But then you add to it the nuclear tipped missiles, and you can see why we panicked, why this was such a serious situation. I'm not going to go through that. I did a whole series, a couple videos on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Went through a day-by-day breakdown of what was happening on each day, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all that because this is a series on Miami. And ultimately, I want to bring this back to Miami. And so most of us are aware of what happened. Maybe not a day-by-day blow, but we're generally aware of what happened. The main thing to take away is that by this point in time, JFK and the White House has realized that it cannot trust the CIA. It cannot trust the Pentagon. It cannot trust the Joint Chiefs. So as they make themselves comfortable in the XCOM realm where they're getting all this advice from all these experts from intelligence and the military, the advice is just the same. It's monolithic in its approach, and that is either A, we have to attack the missile sites, take them out by air, or B, we got to invade Cuba itself, just use this as a pretext, a do-over opportunity, what we should have done, bad pigs. We can't allow these missiles to stand. So we're either A, we got to invade, or B, we got to take out the missile sites. And of course, Kennedy knows either option A or option B is going to lead to a nuclear confrontation with the Soviets. And nobody seems to know if those missiles are operational or how close they are to being operational. The assumption seems to be that they're not. And so the element of time is important. The quicker we launch an invasion or an attack, the probably more successful chances of success. What we found out later was that those missiles were operational, had gone online. And so if Kennedy had followed the advice of his CIA, Pentagon, Joint Chiefs, whatever, and launched an invasion and or attacked the missile bases, there would have been an immediate response. And it would have been just a catastrophic event. Instead, Kennedy and his brother settled on a third option, which is a quarantine. And he was very specific about calling it a quarantine. It's a quarantine is a defensive terminology. A lot of people call it a blockade. Blockade is offensive. You are going out and preventing, seeking out ships or planes, whatever, trying to enter the country. You're preventing them from entering that airspace or the water. A quarantine is but you put a ring around the island. You don't let anything past. They can sail right up to it, but they're gonna have to turn back. And for the purposes of diplomacy, which at the time we were not aware of the diplomacy that was taking place between Kennedy and Khrushchev secretly, the back channel. We thought all the diplomacy was being handled on the sea or in the air, and so you have to have a very strong show of force to make your position known. But a lot of the experts didn't. What nobody knew, except just a few chosen people, was that Kennedy and Khrushchev were secretly back-channeling with each other. Both of them aware of the hardliners in each other's government and the fact that they could not trust those hardliners and the normal diplomatic channels wouldn't work. So they were secretly back-channeling. When Kennedy chose the term quarantine, that was a message to Khrushchev. This is strictly defensive. You put offensive missiles in Cuba. Our response to that is a defensive position. And so it's not an escalation, is my point. And during this 13 days in October, there were enough escalations to get us to the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy's looking for every opportunity to de-escalate. So he calls it a quarantine. It's a good movie. I think it's called 13 Days in October. Kind of illustrates the day-by-day terror. A lot of the terror was because of what people didn't know. And so folks just substitute worst-case scenarios. But there were enough harrowing experiences during the 13 days. It's probably good we didn't know some of these events that took place where one wrong decision by a sub-captain or a ship captain or a pilot or Kennedy or Khrushchev or a rogue general would have put us in a nuclear war with the Soviets. And here you see, this is pretty good photographs of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the quarantine that was taking place. This back channel that is taking place between Kennedy and Khrushchev, you can really see how Khrushchev smartly played this. And I think Kennedy realized Khrushchev kind of had him in a box, if you think about it, because for a long time we had our missiles in Italy and Turkey. You can see in that image, the images below, that are just like now, their missiles in Cuba can reach a lot of our cities. Well, that's been a recent development. For a long time, we've had missiles in Italy and Turkey that could reach inside Soviet territory, reach a lot of their cities. And it was obviously a burr in the bonnet of Khrushchev. He didn't like that. And so he's playing geopolitical chess here. He has cover for putting the missiles in Cuba because Kennedy lied to him after the Bay of Pigs. That's his cover. But B, and more importantly, for strategic and tactical purposes, as far as the Soviets are concerned, they had complained about our missiles in Italy and Turkey for years to no effect. But now, when they put their missiles in Cuba and aimed them at us, they have instantly put us in the same position that they've been in for all these years. And now in the negotiation, they are in a position of strength to say, well, if you want us to remove our missiles from Cuba, then you're going to have to remove your missiles from Italy and Turkey. It's a quid pro quo. Now, that's going to be the starting place for negotiation as far as Khrushchev is concerned. However, because their system is not democratic, he doesn't run for election. He doesn't need to show strength to his people so as to win the next election. He can win a very quiet victory, a victory that only he and his closest aides will know about, but it's a victory nonetheless. If they get the American president to agree to remove the missiles from Italy and Turkey, this whole thing was worth it. Anything above and beyond that's gravy. Now, it would be nice. I'm sure Khrushchev would have loved to be able to go to the UN or do a press conference and announce to the world that he won this exchange with Kennedy in this head-to-head confrontation. But Kennedy is from a democratic country where he does have to run for re-election. And he's already battling the perception amongst many people, and it's a growing perception. He's weak against communism. And this isn't the episode or the series to talk about all those. I've done that. I've covered that in other episodes. But, it wasn't just Bay of Pigs. There was a wall that he allowed to be built in Berlin. There was a meeting that he had with Khrushchev in Vienna that went terribly for Kennedy. And then there was the Bay of Pigs. Now there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a whole series of events that people were looking at, scratching their heads in America saying, I don't think this president's up to the task. And it's going to be used against him in the election of 1964. If Khrushchev wants Kennedy to survive and win that election in 1964 and have a negotiating partner going forward, he's going to help him. He's going to have to do something to help Kennedy save face. In other words, publicly, the perception is going to have to be that Kennedy won this head-to-head confrontation to reassure the American people so that they'll vote for him again in 1964. You say, well, why would Khrushchev care if he wins re-election in 1964? Well, through this back channel, they're going to get to know each other and realize they're very much the same. Neither one wants a war. Both of them are being pressured by hardline elements in their own government. Both of them are surrounded by people they can't trust. They view each other as the only bulwark against their own governments wanting war with their enemy. And as a result of that, Khrushchev's going to realize, I have somebody here I can trust. This is somebody I can work with. There's not a guarantee that if Kennedy loses 1964 and is replaced by, let's say, Nixon, that I can work with Nixon. He's the reason we're in this position to begin with. When he was vice president, he set in motion all this. So you kind of can see where, from Khrushchev's perspective, he makes a decision throughout this 13 days that Kennedy is worth fighting for and preserving. Now, I have to win this exchange, but that win's going to have to be private. It's going to have to be covert. No one can know about it. The world has to think that Kennedy won so that he can win re-election. I don't have to stand for re-election, So publicly, Khrushchev agrees to Kennedy's demand that he remove the missiles from Cuba. And it appears that is the deal that these two leaders made. That's what the world learned. When I was coming up through school, all my history teachers, all my history textbooks taught that the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that Khrushchev backed down and he removed the missiles from Cuba to avoid a nuclear war. It says nothing about what Kennedy gave up because it was private. What Kennedy gave up was that we would remove our missiles from Italy and Turkey. And in addition to that, we would not ever invade Cuba again. Now, if you're Khrushchev, you're saying, well, you already made that promise before. But That was 3 months into his administration when Kennedy was still literally wet behind the ears, didn't know what he didn't know about uh, this relationship with Khrushchev and where it was going, where it was headed. Was still trying to honor the promises he made during the campaign with respect to Cuba and Castro. Things have changed now. They've come back from the brink of nuclear war. And so, and furthermore, he's gotten to know Khrushchev. And he realizes the same thing Khrushchev realizes. I've got a partner over here I can work with. Khrushchev and Kennedy both realize that about each other. And so this time, in a private back channel, not a public declaration, he makes a private promise to Khrushchev, okay, all right, I will not meddle in the affairs of Cuba any longer. And I will remove my missiles from Italy. Now, there was some technical jargon that says you have to remove yours first, whatever. I'll remove mine in 6 months. So it doesn't look like it was a quid pro quo, but it was a quid pro quo. And the folks in the know in Washington know that Kennedy has made two promises to Khrushchev in exchange for one. And so in their view, now this is the CIA, this is the Pentagon, this is the Joint Chiefs. Obviously, the military's got to know because the other one's going to remove those missiles. Obviously, the CIA's got to know because they're the ones launching all these invasions of Cuba, and he's going to order them to stop, cease and desist. So they're going to know. And they view the Cuban Missile Crisis as another failure on the part of JFK to stand up to Khrushchev and to stand up to the communists. And this time it's in our own hemisphere. So the Cuban Missile Crisis publicly, just like in Bay of Pigs, publicly JFK was humiliated and blamed, took the defeat, even though it was the CIA's fault. This time, publicly, JFK was hailed as the hero. He's the guy that stood between us and the abyss, and he got Khrushchev to back down. Privately, the reality was just the opposite. It was Khrushchev who won the exchange. Just like privately, it was in Bay of Pigs, it was the CIA who lost. So I say that because it's very important. This is what I always take a time out with my students. I say, be very careful what you read the news in the moment. Be very careful what you see on television and what you interpret, even in your textbooks 20 years later, what you interpret. We always try to assign blame or give credit. We always try to make somebody out to be a winner and the other person to be a loser. Be very careful what you believe. A lot of times it's meant for public consumption for reasons that are way bigger and go much deeper than we even realize. And it takes decades to unwind this. And you can see, you can be taught things in history class. You can read things in a history textbook. Your history teachers they're not being malevolent in their teaching. They're teaching what they know. But it is clear now that the winner of this exchange was Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. It wasn't the United States. It wasn't Kennedy. And all the important people here know that. They know that. They blamed him after Bay of Pigs, even though privately they knew it really wasn't his fault. He just stood by what he had originally promised. But the defeat was so embarrassing, so humiliating, they scapegoated him. This goads them to no end because here he is being hailed as a hero by the world, by the Americans. And they know privately he gave up the farm to keep the peace. So this is kind of like the final straw. And the after effect of this is such that JFK's now got a very interesting tap dance to do because he's got promises out there that are working at cross purposes. And he's obviously his priorities have changed. At Bay of Pigs, his priority was keeping his people here at home happy, which is why he doubled down on Operation Mongoose. Now his priority has changed, and it's more about keeping Khrushchev happy to prevent a nuclear confrontation. And he's going to have the people at home here to deal with when they find out he's calling off all the Cuba operations. let me go back here. This top photo, I had included it in the Operation Mongoose episode because this was the Kennedy brothers' decision to double down after Bay of Pigs on all things anti-Castro, all the covert paramilitary operations, because you got Castro running around claiming victory after Bay of Pigs. It's tremendously humiliating and embarrassing to be the American president who seemingly lost a head-to-head confrontation with this tin pot dictator in Latin America. And you can kind of look and see and follow through foreign policy decisions of the Kennedy brothers after Bay of Pigs and see just how strong the specter of Fidel Castro was in their minds. It was seemingly every decision they made had Castro in mind. He was always, it's like ever present. He kind of like had, you heard, in sports, sometimes you hear this expression where it's in your head. He's in your head or she's in your head. One of my favorite basketball players growing up, I grew up in the state of Indiana, and so Larry Bird, being from the state of Indiana, was my hero. And one of the tactics that he used to, he didn't have the greatest athletic ability. He wasn't the fastest runner. He couldn't jump the highest. He was playing a sport where that's the kind of talent that you need, but he was one of the best. In my mind, he was the best. How did this slow white guy go out there and dominate all these guys that could run and jump better than he could? And he played mind games with people. There's all kinds of YouTube videos where Bird would get in the heads of his opponents with subtle little trash talking things that he would say to them, the guy who was guarding him or the coach that was coaching against him or whatever team he was playing against, whatever. And he was a master at that. I remember one situation in particular, and I know I'm getting off track here, but it gets me excited when I talk about Larry Bird. The NBA had incorporated into its All-Star Weekend a three-point shootout. It had never been done before. And so they rounded up the best three-point shooters, which at that time, the three-point shot was not a big deal in the NBA. Hardly anybody shot it. It's not near like what they do today. So, they rounded up to, 10 best shooters, whatever, and they're going to have this shoot-off All-Star Weekend. And this story is all over. Everybody's heard this story about Bird. He walked into the locker room where all the folks were waiting, participants were waiting. He was the last one in. He walks in, he goes, looks around. He said it was real quiet in there. Like people were nervous. And he walks in, he looks around, he says, we all know who's winning. Who here's playing for second? And he said everything was just totally quiet. And sure enough, he went out there and won. In fact, he won the first three in a row. First 3 years they did it. He got in their heads. And he was probably the favorite to begin with. But he knew what buttons to push to cause his opponents to think about him while they're shooting against somebody else. Everyone was thinking about him. How could he say that? He's so arrogant. But he was playing mind game. Castro was in the Kennedys' heads. And so after Bay of Pigs, the decisions they made reflected that. We're going to get that son of a bitch, basically. But what had changed is, you look at the bottom photo, is now Kennedy has matured in his statesmanship. He's no longer thinking about being governed by solely revenge, and he's actually making decisions based on bigger priorities, changing priorities, things that are more important. When he's running for president, he makes all these promises based on what he knew at the time, based on what he thought was important at the time. What he thought was important at the time was winning the election. So he made all the promises he felt were necessary. Well, 2 years later, his feelings have changed. He's no longer necessarily making decisions based on his vengeance to get back at Castro and fulfill these campaign promises. The campaign is so long ago, ancient history as far as politics is concerned. Now he's worried about what happened, what has most recently happened, and that is this nuclear confrontation between him and the Soviets, whereby we almost consigned the entire world to nuclear annihilation. And the leader that he worked with and partnered with was not Castro to get him out of that fix, it was Khrushchev. And so now you see in that bottom photo that he is more focused on Khrushchev now, who he realizes is Castro's boss anyway. He's his sugar daddy. He is his, handler or whatever you want to call him. Khrushchev matters in the big, in the whole scheme of things, the big picture. Khrushchev matters a lot more than Castro. So before, when he was small-minded and immature and just starting off as president and not thinking globally, he was more worried about Castro. But now he's thinking about saving the world from nuclear annihilation, and he's found that he has a partner in that. And so now it's more important to him to honor Khrushchev, to work with Khrushchev than it is to get revenge on Castro. And the best the best revenge that Kennedy could have for Castro is to ignore him. Castro wants to be in their heads. Castro wants Kennedy thinking about him night and day. Castro wants the attention. He's, a lot of these, he's an egomaniac, right? He's a blowhard. He's saying things to go out to the world press after Bay of Pigs that self-aggregate. He's glorifying himself at the expense of the American president. And in that moment, it worked. But now Kennedy's been tempered by something much more serious than anything Castro could ever throw at him. And so he realizes the best revenge I could have against Castro is to either ignore him or actually to work with him. And because that keeps this relationship between me and Khrushchev going in the right direction. That's more important than anything I ever achieved with Castro. So it's you can see the growth in Kennedy. But he still has these population groups and these entities within the executive branch, within the government itself, in Washington, that he's made promises to, that he's going to have to appease in some manner, shape, form. After Bay of Pigs, we talked about this in an earlier episode, he had gone down to the Orange Bowl, and famously, there as he posed with the Cuban Brigade, the members that had been released, sent back from Castro back to America, he posed with the flag, said this flag will fly over free Havana. He made promises to all these folks, 35,000 of them in the Orange Bowl, that no expense will be spared. Of course, what they didn't know is he had just changed the name from Operation 40 to Mongoose, and instead of the CIA being in charge, he put his brother Bobby in charge. So he doubled down. So he made that promise. And this wasn't a secret promise. This wasn't a campaign promise. This is a promise as president. This is a promise publicly in front of all these witnesses. So that's a big deal. And of course, on the heels of that, everything's running out of Miami. He makes the promise in Miami. He goes to Miami, makes the promise because that's where all the people are that want to, that's where all the Cuban exiles are. That's where the mafiosos are that care. That's where the CIA base jam wave is. That's where all the action is. That's why he went to Miami. He didn't make this promise in Chicago. He made this promise in Miami. So here we see a big seismic shift in Kennedy's foreign policy. He's choosing peace over politics. It was good politics for him in 59-60 when he was running for president to be against Castro. It made him a hero to the cause. It's why the CIA supported him in his efforts to win the presidency. It's why the mafia, it's why that deal went through with Sam Giancana and his daddy Joe. He got a lot of support from running. He used it as a blunt instrument against Nixon in their debates. He says, "You're not doing enough to get Castro out." And it was an applause line. So from a political standpoint, being anti-Castro was extremely beneficial to Kennedy, probably got him elected. But now after 62 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's making a conscious choice that peace matters more than politics. And so this time, in contrast to Bay of Pigs, where he broke his promise, this time he honors his promise. And he orders all the anti-Castro Operation Mongoose bases to be shut down. And remember, we established where these bases were. You had three of them were right outside Miami. One in the Everglades, one in No Name Key, one in Swan Island. And then he had two in New Orleans on Lake Pontchartrain, one on the north end, one on the south end. So he orders them to be shut down. And of course, we now know, and if you've been following my series, you know that a couple of these bases completely ignored his order. The Everglades base, led by E. Howard Hunt, sent another raid into Cuba, completely disobeying. You talk about insubordination, disobeyed the cease and desist order. And then Frank Sturgis did the same thing from No Name Key. And so the president realizes, and his brother, that just because he gives the order doesn't mean they're going to follow the order. So he has to send 6 helicopter gunships with 40 fully armed customs officials and U.S. Marshals. You say, well, why customs officials and marshals? He couldn't trust anybody else. And they went down into these bases. They seized the C4, the weapons, the ammo, and they burned out these 2 bases, one in No Name Key and the other in Everglades, where Sturgis and Hunt were leading the insurrection, as it were, against Kennedy and his order. And he actually, Bobby, the Attorney General, had Sturgis and Hunt arrested and charged them with violation of the Neutrality Act, making war against a country with whom we are not at war. Now, pretty soon he released them, but he made a point. This is what's going to happen to you if you continue to disobey president's orders. There's bigger things at play here. And that was what was left unsaid, is that I made a promise to Khrushchev, and damn it, I'm going to keep it this time. I know what I know now. I didn't know what I didn't know before. And now that I know what I know, I'm keeping this promise to Khrushchev. So on April of 1961, after Bay of Pigs, Kennedy had made this promise to Khrushchev that he didn't keep. And here we are in December of 62. He's made, the Cuban Missile Crisis is over. He's made this promise, but he goes down to Miami to the Orange Bowl on December 29th, 1962, and continues to try to convince the Cuban population that he is still going to try to get rid of Castro. This is an unbelievable thing Kennedy's got going on here. I guess you could say he's a typical politician. He's speaking out of 2 sides of his mouth. He's trying desperately to appease a large population group, and these people vote. And he can't. And bigger, more important reason is the fact that if he does not at least appear to be trying to get rid of Castro, he'll be viewed as weak against communism, as a Castro sympathizer, and he'll lose the 64 election. So here you see that Kennedy is a promise breaker, because he made a promise to Khrushchev in 61 that he broke to keep the promise to the Cuban people, the anti-Castro Cuban, the refugees. And then you fast forward a year and a half to December 62. He's breaking a promise. He knows he's making a promise. He knows as he's saying it to these Cuban exiles in Miami that he can't keep this promise, because now he's decided he's going to keep his promise to Khrushchev. It's a zero-sum game. When you make a promise and keep it, if you made an opposite promise to somebody else, that means you're breaking it with them. And that's what Kennedy finds himself. He's making 2 promises simultaneously in both occasions. In April of 61, his promise to the Cuban exiles was, I'm going to return this flag to a free Havana. Yay! But the simultaneous promise was to Khrushchev, I'm going to stop meddling in affairs of Cuba. So you're going to, by choosing one action or the other, you're breaking one promise and keeping another. And the same is also true a year and a half later. He's walking a tightrope, and the difference is the first time he broke the promise was to Khrushchev, and it resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The second time he breaks the promise was to the people here at home, and it's going to result in Dallas. I mean, that's really, if you really want to be simple about it, that's the cause and effect. The cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis was his broken promise to Khrushchev in 61. The cause of Dallas was his broken promise to all of the anti-Castro forces here at home. The Cuban exiles, mafia, CIA, the Pentagon, Joint Chiefs, all these four, it's going to result in Dallas. And so anyway, here's that famous Orange Bowl meeting. 2 months after making his second promise to Khrushchev, this time he intends to keep it. He makes a similar promise to the thousands of assembled Cuban exiles in the Miami Orange Bowl. And this was one he knew he couldn't keep. And this is when he makes that famous promise. I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana before the end of my second term. He even puts a time limit on it. So if you want to judge me by the end of my second term. I'm not talking about going to space by the end of the decade when I will no longer be president. I'm talking about this is going to happen before the end of my second term. Give me a second term, and this will be the result. Meanwhile, on the back channel, and I'm sure he's telling Khrushchev, hey, listen, don't listen to my words publicly that I make these speeches to these folks here at home. I got to say what I got to say. And Khrushchev, no doubt, understood that. But because they have this back channel, now he can keep the promise to whom he's talking personally, and he can break the promise to these forces that have been pushing him in one direction to try to get rid of Castro. So that back channel is so important because let's say that they didn't have the back channel, and he goes out and says this at the Orange Bowl. No doubt Khrushchev is going to know an hour later what he just said. He's going to think, oh, I've been lied to again. You know, he didn't publicly promise the anti-Castros after Bay of Pigs, but they all knew because he doubled down on Operation Mongoose. And he said no expense will be spared, etc., to get rid of Castro. And he sent his brother out. So it's pretty clear he was doubling down on Operation 40 with this new Operation Mongoose. He established those bases, and boom, everything was full steam ahead. He broke the promise with me. Now he's secretly promising me and reassuring me that whatever he says to these people is for public consumption only. It means nothing. What means everything is what's going on in this back channel. So this is where Kennedy finds himself. Here's that famous picture. By the way, Jackie, it's notable that Jackie was there. He's going to Miami, where he knows, and we'll talk about his mole in Miami and why he knows things are dicey for him in this city. He knows this is going to be a hard sell. All these people in the stands have witnessed him now. This is December of 62. They've seen him in action. This is no longer a blank slate, a politician running for president the first time, making promises and hope. Everybody's hoping he'll keep him. He now has a record. And 3 months into his first year, in their view, he caved on the air support, caused the disaster of Bay of Pigs. Now, to his credit, he came back with Operation Mongoose, and they continued the struggle. So they sort of gave him that one and said, well, he's young, he's learning on the job, et cetera, et cetera. But since then, he has, in an opportunity for a do-over, he refused to invade Cuba. He refused to go down and bomb the missile sites. And because the CIA is leaking to the leaders of these anti-Castro Cuban exile groups that Kennedy is calling off the war against Castro. And he made a promise to Khrushchev about no future invasions of Cuba. They're leaking this information. They now realize that he is betraying that cause. And because they're also leaking, Pentagon and Joint Chiefs are leaking that he has promised to remove missiles from Italy and Turkey. These people, in a broader sense, like the CIA and the national security apparatus around Kennedy, realized that not only did he make a promise to end the U.S. unofficial war with Cuba, he is removing missiles that caused us to have an advantage in the Cold War against the Soviets. He's removing those missiles from Italy and Turkey. In other words, he lost this exchange with Khrushchev in this missile crisis. And so he now has this record where in the Bay of Pigs, in their view, he caved. And now in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he gave up two things for the one thing that he got. He is now calling off the paramilitary operations and the CIA covert war against Cuba. He's closed the 5 bases. He's seized all the C4 and the explosives and the ammunition. He arrested E. Howard Hunt. He arrested Frank Sturgis. And of course, by the time he gets in 63, he's going to find out about the S Force. He's going to order that to stand down. But that hasn't happened yet. Just taking into account what they know at this point, these people in the stands are extremely skeptical that this guy can get the job done. And so he's going down there trying to keep up appearances. He's got to win enough votes in Florida and Texas. This is another calculus that goes into this whole thing. He has already made the decision that LBJ is not going to be on the ticket in 64. LBJ was only on the ticket in 60 because he could help him win Southern votes. Enough Southern states. It was going to be a close election, which it was. But the calculus is now that he doesn't need LBJ. He's more of an established product. People know who he is. They have confidence in him, whereas before they didn't know. The opponent won't be as strong. So they don't think he needs LBJ on the ticket in 64. And they don't want LBJ on the ticket for sheer political reasons. They know that'll set him up to be the next president. The Kennedys and the Johnsons don't like each other. He's an ambitious guy. He wants to be president. And the best position that Kennedy could give him to be the next president is to keep him on the ticket. The sitting vice president ascends to the presidency afterwards. So they want to drop him and put on there just a placeholder, someone who has no political ambition, setting it up for his brother Bobby to run in 68 so that Bobby can inherit the throne. I mean, they have this master plan where John F. Kennedy is president from 60 to 68. Bobby runs in 68, he's president till 76, at which point he hands off to Teddy, and Teddy becomes president from 76 to 84. It almost happened, if you think about it, because Kennedy was president in 60, and he would have been, if he hadn't been assassinated, he would have won re-election and been president in 68. Bobby did run in 68, and if he hadn't been assassinated, he would have won in 68, which means he'd have been president for 8 years. And Teddy did run in 76. Now, Teddy didn't win the nomination because he had all kinds of scandal and such. But you can see, even with 2 assassinations and scandal, they still tried to put that plan in place. And when he is appearing here at this Orange Bowl, there's been no assassination in Dallas. There's been no assassination in L.A. of his brother Bobby. And Teddy hasn't gotten himself in problems yet. So the plan is still a full go. So he's trying to keep appearances to win that 64 election and to soften the hatred in the Miami community for him and for the failures in their view that he has been the cause of. He brings his wife. Oftentimes when Kennedy traveled, he didn't bring Jackie with him. And we could go into a whole different discussion here about why that was. Kennedy liked his freedom on these trips. But when he was in trouble, When he was going into hostile territory, he almost always brought Jackie with him, which is why uh, on November 22, 1963, almost a year later, about 11 months later, Jackie is with him in Dallas. He knows he's going into hostile territory, just like he knew in December of 62 when he went to Miami, he was in hostile territory. So he brings Jackie, because everybody loved Jackie. There was no stink on her. She was the first lady, very glamorous, et cetera, et cetera. This is where he makes that famous promise. I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana before the end of my second term. So this is all happening in Miami. Now, this is after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now that the back channel has been established between him and Khrushchev, and they are negotiating, and this is another thing that we're going to find out in 63 is this back channel continued after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, it wasn't just for the purposes of ending the crisis at hand. It went forward past that into the negotiation to the nuclear test ban. And so these conversations between him and Khrushchev are ongoing, and they're personal in nature. It's the leader of America. They're exchanging letters, all these communications back and forth, and they're getting to know each other, and they're discovering that they are more alike than they are different. And so now the promises are personal. It's not political. It's a personal promise that he made. The promises that he's making here to the Cuban people are political. He never intends to keep them. Never intends to keep them. We fast forward to June of 63, and this is when RFK first learns the S-Force, this assassination team that's running around still being trained and running operations into Cuba trying to kill Castro. Now remember, he's made a promise to Khrushchev, and so far he's dealt with rogue operators like E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, who defied his cease and desist order, but that's what he knew. He didn't know about the S-Force. And so when he finds out, he immediately orders the S-Force to stand down, which is when William Pauly loads up his yacht with all these S-Force members, and they leave Miami for Cuba in another mission. This is reminiscent of Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt launching their Operation Mongoose missions after being told not to. He's launching a S-Force operation, and this is that famous yacht story where they're going in to rescue these two Soviet colonels who have information about the missiles that have not been dismantled. So they're going to try to rescue them, and that story is going to be in Time Life magazine, hugely embarrassing to Kennedy. The national security state's going to use it against Kennedy, say, see, you got duped. And then they're also going to try to assassinate Castro while they're there and then bring his body back on the yacht. And that Time Life photographer or reporter, Dick Billings, is going to take photos. And that's going to be the cover of the next Time Life magazine, the dead body of Castro. Can you imagine how many magazines that would sell? This is all happening after he orders the S-Force to stand down. This seems to be the standard operating procedure. Kennedy finds out about something and he orders it to be shut down to stop, and they go and do it anyway. And it's all with the intention of goading Nikita Khrushchev and Castro into a war to make it look like Kennedy is either A, violating his promise, or he's not in control of his own government. Either way, if they can cause some sort of damage, especially if it's public, if they can get it in the cover of Time Life magazine, for example, it'll force the Soviets into the war that these folks have always wanted. So that's June of 63, right? So by this point in time, as we advance through 63, the JFK had completely lost his appetite to go after Castro. By now, he's on to bigger things. His geopolitical viewpoint has expanded. Instead of zeroing in on this little island 90 miles off the coast of Florida in this tin pot dictator, now he's thinking globally and how he and Khrushchev can reshape the world post-Cuban Missile Crisis. He's made this promise to Khrushchev. He's called off Operation Mongoose. He's ordered the S force to stand down. And now the CIA finds out that he's secretly back-channeling, not just with Khrushchev, which they're furious enough about that, but he's also secretly back-channeling with Castro. He's established a back-channel through William Atwood and Lisa Howard. Now, Lisa Howard is a on and off again girlfriend of Castro. So she, kind of like Maria Lorenz, has access to him because she's a woman. And so William Atwood, who resigns his position within the government to be a private actor in this back channel negotiation, begins negotiating with Castro's people for a meeting where they can normalize relations with Cuba. That's the next step. That's the next step in the evolution of JFK, where he goes from in 61 trying to overthrow and kill him to now trying to normalize relationships with him. And of course, the CIA knows about this. You see, well, by the way, here's a bunch of pictures of Lisa Howard talking directly with Castro. She had earned his trust, and so she was the perfect vehicle by which this back channel could take place. There's some speculation I've heard that Lisa Howard had a relationship with JFK as well. I don't know that to be true. Wouldn't that be interesting? It wouldn't be the first time, when Kennedy shared a girlfriend with Sam Giancana, Judith Campbell, and so it wouldn't be the first time he shared a girlfriend with somebody notorious. But I don't know that to be a fact. But I know she was a girlfriend of Castro. She slept with him. She talked pretty openly about his sexual prowess, which incidentally Maria Lorenz did as well. Anyway, you said, well, how did this back channel work? Rene Vallejo, who represented Castro's side of things, would talk on the phone with William Atwood, and Castro would listen in. It's kind of like the old party line. When I was a kid, we had a party line in our neighborhood, and we had all these codes about how many rings and stuff to indicate who the phone call was coming to, whose house. But you could pick up the phone and listen to other people's conversations. I used to do it all the time. So here's Fidel Castro listening in on one line while his guy Rene Vallejo talked with William Atwood. And they're trying to set up a preliminary meeting to identify the parameters of what would be discussed between himself. It was never going to be a head-to-head meeting with Kennedy and Castro. That could just not happen. But it was going to be Atwood representing Kennedy, meeting head-to-head, face-to-face with Fidel Castro. So they're trying to hammer out an agreement what topics we're going to discuss. And Vallejo said that they would send instructions. And the reason we know what was being discussed on this, I'll tell you in just a minute. But anyway, he's saying Cuba will send instructions through our ambassador Carlos Lechuga, and that from that you can determine what the agenda is going to be for Atwood's meeting with Castro. And meanwhile, Atwood is telling Vallejo, listen to JFK's speech. He would say he's going to be giving a speech in Miami. Listen to that speech. There's something he's going to say that is a direct communication between him and Castro. So in the speech in Miami, JFK challenged Castro and basically said that if Cuba would cease being a weapon in an effort dictated by external powers to subvert the other American republics, everything was possible. Now, as Kennedy is talking in code. He's saying something to the audience there that they're interpreting one way, but when Castro is hearing it, he's interpreting it another way. And his real intent in this whole thing, his audience is Castro. The people in the Orange Bowl might as well not even been there. He's talking to Castro. And the reason Castro knows that he's talking to him because Atwood told him, listen closely to what he says in this speech. He's going to say something directly to you, which is the deal breaker. or the deal maker, depending upon how you respond. If you will agree to this term, everything is possible. Basically, what he's saying is quit meddling in the affairs of other Latin American countries trying to foment communist revolution in Venezuela and all these other places. If you will, or Nicaragua, wherever, if you will stop meddling in the affairs of other Latin American countries, we'll let Cuba be whatever Cuba wants to be. We'll leave you alone. Everything is possible. Just stop meddling in the affairs of other Latin American countries. That's what Kennedy is saying to Castro in this speech. He says it in open air to everybody, but it's a message to Castro. And Castro knows it's a message to him because he's been alerted to this by Atwood. My boss is going to say something in this speech that is very important. And it is, here we are talking about what topics we're going to cover and what are the non-negotiables. Here is my boss's non-negotiable right from his own mouth. Fidel Castro met for 6 hours with Jean Daniel, a reporter. This is in a Havana hotel room to learn more about this dialogue that's going on with JFK. And this is a picture of Jean Daniel with Castro in that hotel room. And Daniel's another one of these intermediaries through whom the Kennedy White House is back-channeling to Castro. And Daniel recounted that in personal conversations that he'd had with JFK, that JFK had actually spoke highly of the Cuban Revolution. He had actually endorsed it. And the thing that bothered Kennedy, this is coming from Jean Daniel as he's talking to Castro, was not the revolution, not that he was a communist, not that he kicked out the American companies from Cuba and nationalized the industries, kicked out the mafioso, none of that. What caused him grief and what he could not abide by was the fact that Castro almost caused a nuclear war. Now, this is a little bit disingenuous because Bay of Pigs was before the Cuban Missile Crisis, before the almost nuclear war. So JFK is being a little bit disingenuous if John Daniel is quoting him accurately, because he had already committed to the anti-Castro cause before Castro almost caused a nuclear war. Nevertheless, Jean Daniel is telling him, if you hadn't done that, put the missiles in Cuba, my boss would have, Kennedy would have no problem with you. He certainly has no problem with your revolution. So then Castro gets defensive. He says, well, the only reason I put the missiles in Cuba is because he invaded me at Bay of Pigs. And Khrushchev and I decided this was the best way to fight back against the second invasion. So they kind of had their tit for tat. And meanwhile, Jean Daniel is communicating just like William Atwood is to Castro's diplomat. John Daniel is communicating just like Lisa Howard is face to face with Castro. Everything that Kennedy's telling him, and it's kind of like that old deal when you're a kid and you want to know if somebody what somebody thinks about you. So you go to a third party. So what is she saying about me, or what is he saying about me? And the old boyfriend girlfriend tap dance when you're in elementary school, where you go to the third party and you ask will you tell Jimmy that I said this, or will you ask Sally if she'll do this? And it's all this third party stuff because everybody's too nervous to talk. Now, you don't have the same dynamic in play here in the sense that people are nervous to talk. You just can't put Kennedy and Castro in the same room together. You just can't. So you have to go through these third parties, these trusted intermediaries, this back channel. And so that's what's going on. And so in this back channel, Castro expressed the hope that JFK would win re-election. He, like Khrushchev, has decided, as he's watched Kennedy for the first 3 years, that we have a better chance of world peace with this guy Kennedy than we do anybody else in the American political theater. This is our best hope. If you're Castro, the fact that Kennedy is back channeling with you, trying to normalize relations with Cuba, is a huge development. And he knows it's very risky for Kennedy to do this. So he knows that his best bet at becoming a A world leader, a legitimate world leader, is if he can be legitimized by this normalization process from America that is being led by the American president, John F. Kennedy. In other words, John F. Kennedy is his best friend. He is his best hope to stay in power. And Khrushchev has made the determination in his 3 years of observing and working with and back-channeling with Kennedy that Kennedy is his best hope, the world's best hope of peace. So here you have two foreign leaders on the opposite side of the Cold War divide, who have, because of these back channels, this is the importance of diplomacy. This is the importance of personal face-to-face communication. This is the importance of communication, period. I mean, you take the back channels out of this, and both sides are grandstanding. And we probably would have had a nuclear war in the missile crisis. And we certainly wouldn't have any chance of normalization of relations between Cuba and America. But the back channel makes all things possible. And that's why the CIA and the Joint Chiefs and everybody was so furious with this back channel, because they don't want peace. They don't want normalization of relations between us and Cuba. And Kennedy, with this back channel, is working around them. He's like a bypass around the city of Chicago, right? Instead of driving along the Dan Ryan Expressway and going through Chicago at the height of traffic and stop and go traffic, you go around it on a bypass, and you miss all that. And that's what he's doing. They're out of the loop, and it's infuriating them. Now you say, well, how do they know all this is going on? Well, the back channel negotiations with Castro was discovered because the CIA had bugged Howard's apartment and the phones. They knew that JFK was talking to Howard, and Howard was talking, and he was also talking to this William Atwood, and then because they had both phones tapped, they would know exactly what JFK was telling them because they would talk amongst themselves. Howard and Atwood would compare notes about what they'd heard from JFK before they go talk to Castro's diplomat. So they knew everything in real time that JFK was doing and saying. And their way to combat that is to leak it to all the right people. And so at the moment that this Miami Orange Bowl gala is taking place, all the right people that are in charge of this Cuban exile population down there already knows that the guy standing there on the stage making promises is secretly back-channeling with Cuba and with Castro, trying to normalize relations. So they know he's lying. And now he's lying right to their face. You know, the old calculus was, well, he didn't know what he didn't know. And so when he said things and he couldn't deliver, it's because of inexperience. There wasn't any maliciousness or malevolence involved. It was just, and now he knows better and he'll do better. But now they realize, because of this back channel that's been bugged, they now know he's lying straight to their face. And so this back channel negotiation is viewed as the final betrayal. As far as the Miami-based intelligence apparatus, the Miami-based anti-Castro paramilitary apparatus, as far as the Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban exile population, as far as the Miami-based organized crime element, all this stuff coming out of Miami, all of this apparatus that has been aimed at Castro for all these years, realize that their president, the guy who they've been supporting all this time, is lying to their face. And as long as, and it's increasingly going in that direction. You know, he came in to the presidency a believer in the anti-Castro cause, but now 3 years later, he's not a believer anymore. He's on the other side. And he's probably going to win a re-election in 64, which means their opportunity to get Castro there will be no opportunity to get Castro as long as this guy's president. And that means 68. And if his brother becomes president in 68, then there may never come another opportunity to get Castro. And so you can see what the calculus and how it's changing in their minds. They realize for the first time The real enemy is not Castro. The real enemy is Kennedy. Now, irony of all ironies, and it's not ironic because it was an accident, it was intended. The day that Kennedy is killed in Dallas on November 22 is the exact same day the CIA arranges for a poison pen to be delivered to a military officer in Cuba who's disaffected and is willing to play his role in his part in the plot to kill Castro. On the exact same day, the CIA participates in a plot to kill the American president. They also participate in a plot to kill Fidel Castro. And symbolically, it was chosen intentionally to happen on the same day. Just like 20 days earlier, they tried to kill Kennedy on November 2 in Chicago on the exact same day that the CIA killed the Diem brothers in Vietnam. So that, you know, it's amazing the chutzpah that the CIA has to try to do this in broad daylight on the same day to assassinate these heads of state at the same time on the same day. They failed in Chicago because though they succeeded in Vietnam getting rid of the Diem brothers on that day, they failed in Chicago because of the mole or the FBI informant named Lee who gave up the plot in advance. They fail in Dallas on November 22, where they succeed in Dallas in killing JFK. They fail in Cuba because, again, the people responsible for spying for Castro alert him to the presence of this poison pen and even alert him as to who the Cuban military officer was that was going to be delivering that poison pen. But it wasn't for lack of trying. It wasn't for lack of trying. The CIA tried twice, and that's just the two times I know of, to kill world leaders on the same day who were obstacles to their plans. And the obstacles were they wanted a war in Vietnam, and JFK was not going to give them to them. They wanted a war with the Soviet Union and with Cuba, and JFK was not going to give it to them. And they wanted to assassinate Castro, and JFK was not going to allow them to do that. I mean, you go on and on. For a multiplicity of reasons, JFK became the enemy, and he had to be dealt with. So, and of course, all of this is happening. The center of all this activity is in Miami. So you say, well, the leaks that caused this deep state sabotage. What are some of these leaks? Well, in October of 62, the leak to the national security apparatus concerned JFK's promise to Khrushchev not to invade Cuba again. This is a leak that went right to the CIA. And it really wasn't a leak to the CIA. It was a leak from the CIA. The CIA knew about JFK's promise to Khrushchev not to invade Cuba again because he then passes the order down to them to close the Operation Mongoose bases. So it's clear there's been a change in policy. And then from there, the CIA leaked it to all the right people. And then a couple months later, in December of 62, having shut down the Operation Mongoose bases and closed the training camps, the CIA leaks that now to the appropriate people, all these exiles and these anti-Castroites. And in October of 63, they leaked JFK's secret backchannel negotiations with Castro that are an attempt to normalize relationships between the United States and Cuba. So this is how the deep state fights back. They leak the information supposedly classified, supposed to be secret. They leak it to the right people. And what JFK is trying to accomplish secretly is not secret anymore. And so when he goes out and makes these promises at the Orange Bowl, or else, they know, these people know. And that's the That's the power of these leaks, because it's secret and the president doesn't know that they know. So he goes and he makes this bold promise, not realizing that everyone listening to him knows that he's lying to their face. And that is the knife, that is the final betrayal that they cannot abide by. The leak takes that passion. Uh, you know, I started off this series by saying that there's going to be a turn, and the turn is such that they're going to take the passion that all these anti-Castro forces had to get rid of Castro, and it's going to double back on Kennedy, like boomerang on Kennedy, and that same passion is now going to be aimed at him. No one likes to be lied to. No one likes to admit they've been lied to, but people are more forgiving if they find out after the fact that they were lied to. Uh, Time has passed, uh, but in the moment, if as they're hearing someone lie to their face and they know that they're being lied to, uh, that is infuriating. That's absolutely infuriating. And so that passion almost doubles back against Kennedy in a more intense, with a higher level of intensity. And you can see they succeed in their effort to kill him, whereas they fail in all of those efforts to kill Castro. It's just an amazing story. The final betrayal, Dr. Jose Miro Cardona, who was head of the Cuban Revolutionary Council in Miami, and this was an organization that was subsidized by the CIA, as were all these anti-Castro outfits, resigned in protest against Kennedy's shift in Cuban policy. And you can see this is a pretty high-profile individual. He's made a Time magazine cover on April 28th, 1960. I'm looking at the date there. It looks like 61. So this is right after Bay of Pigs. And this is the feature story, the Time magazine. He is on the cover, and it's entitled The Cuban Disaster. And he's hung on with Kennedy through this time. And as long as the Cuban policy is such that it's an effort to get rid of Castro, even with these failures, guys like Jose Miro Cardona support him. But now they realize that they've been snookered and the policy has changed. And the final betrayal is when he stands there in front of them and the Orange Bowl and lies to their face. And he concluded that Kennedy's actions proved that, quote, the struggle for Cuba was in the process of being liquidated by the U.S. government. And so he resigned in protest. And that is sum and substance of the attitudes of these anti-Castroites, most of them in Miami, who have done the math and have determined that Kennedy has betrayed them once too many times. And their whole life is about getting rid of Castro so they can go home. And either they're going to have to give up on that dream and just resign themselves to making a new home here in America and giving up the cause, or they're going to have to fight to get rid of the obstacle to their dream so they can resume their efforts to get rid of Castro. And it's pretty obvious what decision they make. All right, that was a long one today. A lot of information, but I hope I explained it well. It's a fascinating story. So much that you could take from this. For example, the growth of Kennedy, for example, from trying to win political office in 60 to trying to keep world peace in 63, and how that changes his calculations as to which promises he's going to keep, which promises he's going to break. All right. The importance of a back channel, person-to-person communication. I mean, it prevented a nuclear war, and it set the stage for a nuclear test ban. It set the stage for peace, and it was prepared to set the stage for a peaceful relationship between us and Cuba until it was all sabotaged. By the way, if you spin it forward to Nixon in the late 60s, early 70s, that person-to-person communication brought about détente. Remember, he went to Russia, he went to China, and these same people that wanted war when Kennedy was president wanted a continuation of that war when Nixon was president. It's no accident that the two presidents who initiated person-to-person communication with the enemy and were on the throes of peace were both eliminated, one by assassination, one by forced resignation. So it shows you how strong the war lobby is in our country and how much money stands to be made by continuing this policy of constant, ever-present war. That's something that's relevant today. Why do you think they fight Trump so hard? He's the only president last, I don't know, 3 or 4 times just in my lifetime that hasn't gotten us in a war. They hate him for it. It's a lot of lost income, a lot of lost money. So those are a couple the importance of back channels, person-to-person communication, the importance of growth. Some presidents get in office, they don't grow. They don't grow into the job. They stay the same. Kennedy grew by leaps and bounds, and he left a lot of people in the dust, and they didn't grow with it. So much to take from all of this. And the fact that world leaders, even on opposite ends of the spectrum, could recognize in their counterparts folks that they could work with. And, it had a cost for Khrushchev, too. The only one of these 3 leaders that managed to stay in power was Castro, ironically. Kennedy ends up dead. Khrushchev ends up run out of power within a year by his own hardline elements. So the guys who were trying to bring peace got ran out. And then when Bobby ran in 68 with the promise of continuing what his brother started, he was assassinated as well. So, boy, this topic is so fascinating to me. So, all right, that's enough for today, episode 11. I hope everybody has a great day, a blessed day. Until next time, I wish everybody the best. Thank you.